Bam.
I'm Giles Milton. Hello, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
This is great. I'm gonna these two up here have written a book, each of them. And by the way, congratulations on your award, Halik. They so Halik wrote about the resistance during World War II, all of them, and Giles wrote a book about the English side of the saboteurs who invented the things and assisted the assistants. And so I thought it would be a wonderful conversation to combine their knowledge and let them talk at a level that, gosh, I can't communicate the level you guys can with your clarity and from your research. So both of you, thank you for coming on the show. Halik, welcome back. And I guess let's start with your award, Halik. You won something last week in the world of history. Tell us what it is. Tell us the relevance of that award and how big is that?
Well, the Wolfson History Prize is awarded annually to the best history book published that year. It's worth £50,000 to the winner.
Wow.
And I was privileged enough to be selected as the winner this year, beating 5 professors in the process.
Wow.
So it came as a complete surprise to me. I mean, I'd been honoured enough by being nominated, and to win, it was sort of, oh my God. And I was just floating on air for the rest of that evening.
Yeah, that is amazing. Good job.
My emails ever since.
Yeah, that's great. Giles, anything to say to Halik about her award?
It's brilliant. I mean, the Wolfson Prize is incredibly well known in this country. It's just the top award, and just massive congratulations. It's absolutely fantastic. I hope you don't spend all the money at once.
No, I've got no intentions of spending it all at once, and certainly not quite all on books, because I don't think I've got enough room for £50,000 worth of bookshelves.
All right, there's the link if you want to look up the Wolfson. It's really a fantastic honor. And was that for Resistance? Was that the awarding book?
Yes, that was for Resistance. Yes.
Wow, that is great. Well, let's not minimize that, but let's move forward. I guess I'm going to ask you, Halik, to ask Giles the first question, because I'm sure there's something that you would like to know based upon his work.
Well, I mean, I have read Giles's work, and so I was interested in how the saboteurs were trained to select their targets.
That's a very interesting question, because there was no real history or tradition of guerrilla warfare, sabotage practices, etc., at the very start of the war. In fact, a lot of people argued, particularly in the establishment, in the British establishment, that this was a rather ungentlemanly thing to do, that the British didn't fight like this. You know, we fought a clean war, a decent war. And there was a small group of people centered on one of the main characters in my book, Colin Gubbins, who said, no, there has to be a different way of doing things. Colin Gubbins had fought in Ireland, a very nasty, dirty war in Ireland. He'd studied tactics from other battlefields over the course of previous decades. And he particularly looked at gangsters like Al Capone in Chicago, and how they attacked nightclubs and went about their business. And he began to realize that while the British Army was in absolutely no position to take on Hitler's war machine, in 1939, 1940, it simply was no match for it. What Hitler's war machine depended on, because it was a highly mechanized force, it depended on railways, it depended on fuel depots, on electricity power stations, and that these were all soft targets that could quite easily be taken out with not too much effort. And so from this sprang up what would become known as the Special Operations Executive, SOE, and they would set up training schools around the country to begin to train complete novices in how to blow up a power station, how to take out a bridge, how to destroy a factory, and the best way of doing this, and how to use targeted explosives. This was a very revolutionary idea at the time. The RAF were saying, no, we should just carpet bomb, whatever. And Colin Gubbins would say, no, it would be much more efficient to drop one person in by parachute with a load of explosives and blow up key machinery. And so that was the sort of essential idea behind this new organization.
Yes, I always think Colin Gubbins made SOE, really, because he had a clear idea and clear sense of organization of, setting up the system of having an organizer, how to train the people to train the saboteurs, the courier system, the radio operator, the sort of core team who would then build up networks, who would carry out these explosives and recruit. I mean, what I find fascinating is the number of railway men who were recruited to blow up their own railways. And I know there was a successful court case in France, I think in the early 1960s, when someone was denied his pension because he'd been not working on the railways between 1940 and 1944. He says he'd been blowing them up. So he got his full pension.
Wonderful. I mean, what's particularly interesting about Colin Gubbins, I think, is he was a complete outsider to the British establishment. He was Scottish for a start, brought up in the Scottish Highlands. He hadn't gone to Eton and Oxford, the elite establishments where many of those who were working in the British Army and the British government had been to these schools and universities. And so he was very much an outsider. He'd left school at 16, gone into the army. As I say, he'd fought in a very bloody First World War. He'd fought, seen many of his friends blown to pieces in the mud of Flanders. He then, as I say, he'd fought in Ireland as well. And the men, and indeed the women, because women were to play quite an important role in special operations executive, they tended to be outsiders like him. They were the ones he felt comfortable working with. And they were also the ones, I think, who were very happy to think outside the box. And this was, I think, the sort of whole reason behind SOE was thinking outside the box, doing things differently. And that was the leadership that Colin Gubbins brought to this new organization.
Yes, I think it is important that the number of the agents who were recruited and were happy to join had not wanted to be infantry officers. They wanted not to have to obey what had been in the First World War suicidal orders. They wanted to make decisions for themselves. If it got them killed, so be it. But they would have a large part of the decision making.
Yeah,
I'm going to jump in. That's an interesting point because of the brutality of in war, the brutality of World War I. Like, hey, we're going to go over the edge of this safety and go into this zone where everybody gets killed. And when you hear people talk about it, just the other day I saw a story in the news talking about the ineffectiveness of the saboteurs in World War II. And if you look at the macro, sure, they almost don't exist. But I've worked with a unit that was targeted by a sniper in Iraq, and it completely changed our day-to-day operations. We had to spend hours and hours trying to deal with the fact that this sniper was out there. We had to bring in other assets. We had to slow down everything about our operations. This is one dude who did shoot a couple of people, but it was absolutely incapacitating for that time when that person was there. And then we didn't even know when they left, right? So we had to make the assumption that they were there until we finally were like, can we look around? So one person slowed down an entire machine of more than 1,000 people.
Well, Pete, I'd love to give a little example of a very similar one from World War II, because I think it illustrates so much of what I wanted to say in the book. And that's the story of Harry Ray, who was a saboteur. And the British have been trying to destroy for many, many months the vast industrial complex run by Peugeot in central France. And they tried to bomb it from the air. Can you hear me or not?
I can. Yeah, I'm talking to my crew here.
Sorry. Okay. So the RAF, the Royal Air Force, had tried to take out this factory because the Peugeot factory, the biggest industrial complex in Europe, had been obviously turned over by the Germans to making tanks, to making aircraft, and all the machinery of war. So Lord Portal at the RAF had sent in squadrons and squadrons of planes to bomb this factory, and he'd succeeded in dropping an awful lot of bombs, none of which landed on the factory, but most of which landed on the villages around Sochaux, and had killed many of the French factory workers, but had actually left the factory itself completely untouched. And he was, like so many in the British establishment, he was scathing about the special operations executive. He didn't believe, he thought they were just sort of public school, private educated schoolboys, you know, getting up to no good, but not really achieving anything. So Harry Ray argued his case. He said, I want to be dropped in by parachute. I'm going to break my way into the factory, hopefully with the help of some of the factory workers, and I'm going to destroy key elements of the machinery that's churning out vast quantities of Nazi German tanks and aircraft, etc. He did exactly this. He was dropped in by parachute, fantastically daring operation. He managed to get a few of the factory workers on side, managed to get inside the factory with a sack full of explosives, many of them specially designed for the operation, and succeeded in really destroying some of the key equipment, which meant the factory was unable to produce weapons for many, many months. And so this was a sort of one of the key operations, I think, which was incredibly successful and showed that carpet bombing by the RAF created a lot of mess on the ground, but often completely missed its targets and killed many innocent civilians while doing so. Whereas one man breaking into the factory and putting explosives on selected machinery could cause damage that couldn't be repaired instantly. In fact, often took many months to repair, because what they would do, for example, these saboteurs, they wouldn't go in and just blow up every item of machinery in the factory. They'd blow up the same part on each machine, the same irreplaceable part on each machine, rendering that machine incapable of operating. So they were very carefully planned and targeted operations. And in fact, once the Germans did finally get the factory up and running again, Harry Ray went back in again with another lot of explosives and did exactly the same again. So a wonderful, a brilliant operation on the part of SOE.
But on the other hand, what I would say, Giles, is it worked there because Peugeot himself agreed to cooperate with Harry Ray. Now, that wasn't the case with Renault. Renault refused to, and so the RAF bombed the Renault works on the outskirts of Paris several times. Obviously with some civilian casualties as well. And I think the French always said that the reason why Renault was nationalized after the war was because they hadn't agreed to the bombing. The same with the Michelin works producing all the tires in southern France. Again, they didn't cooperate. And so in the end, Pearl Witherington, who was operating in the area, radioed back to London, you're going to have to bomb the hell out of them.
That's really an interesting point, actually. And Renault, I mean, Harry Ray worked quite hard on the Peugeot family to persuade them that if they didn't allow Harry in, if they didn't facilitate this operation, their factory ultimately would be bombed to pieces by the RAF. So it was he had to do a bit of persuading to allow this operation to take place.
Oh, yes, he did. And I mean, he was very persuasive. And there was also another operation against some works producing dynamite, I think in Southwest, because if the RAF bombed that, they wouldn't just bomb the factory. It would be the entire area would be flattened. And so, again, that had to be a targeted operation. You could do things like that. There was one done by the Free French part of SOE against some aluminium works, that they cut the electricity so thoroughly that the aluminium set in the machines, and so remained inoperable for months.
Yeah, wow. That's the targeted nature. Speaking in modern times, when we look at a nation that's trying to become nuclear capable, they required certain elements to get there, and one of those is a special kind of water. You guys know where I'm going now, but that access to that water, if you deny that, they can't make the bigger machine, and so you can target something. So I think that's interesting, and I want to bring in this piece too. I just looked up an F-35, the most up-to-date jet fighter in the world, costs $89 million. Lockheed Martin hopes to get that thing down to $80 million in a couple of years. I'm going to tell you right now, the simplest, smallest, and most inexpensive bomb by Jefferies is infinitely more capable and has destroyed way more things, material, than the F-35 ever will.
I mean, the alongside the Special Operations Executive, you had this organization called MD1. And MD1, it stood for Ministry of Defence 1. Now, Winston Churchill, of course, was Minister of Defence, and this became his own sort of special unit, which was there to design bespoke guerrilla weapons and sabotage weapons to be used in sabotage operations. It was in a little country house outside London. And what was extraordinary, incidentally, the building still exists. It's a sort of old Victorian mock Tudor building where a group of brilliant engineers, inventors, mavericks, mathematicians, physicians, they all gathered in this place, and they were there to dream up the most sort of lethal and weapons known to mankind, and that's what they got on with, ably assisted by a team of brilliant women as well. And what's interesting when you're mentioning the cost of the F-35 and this is that this thing was run on a shoestring. It had a tiny budget, and although when they needed money, they simply called Professor Lindemann, who was extremely close to Winston Churchill, and money would pour into their coffers. But these weapons didn't cost very much. They were low budget, low cost, and highly effective. That was the sort of idea. So in this country house, for the course of the war, they built some of the most fantastic weapons that were used on some of the great operations of sabotage. So I think you were alluding to the attack on the heavy water factory in Norway, the Norsk hydro factory. The weapons used to destroy that factory or the machinery inside it were produced in this place called the Firs, which was the home to MD1.
There's that, and also simple weapons that anyone could use. We're not talking about trained saboteurs, but you conceal explosive in coal that then gets put within consignment of coal going on a train through Germany and explodes once it's put into the furnace. That basically blows up the engine. The other one was, well, for a better word, donkey shit. That was used in the Balkans a lot, or because they travelled a lot by mule, and they would just distribute that, put this out in the village streets or between the villages. The Germans are not going to stop every vehicle just because of something that they drive through every day. Or, once it goes bang once, they have to stop and sweep. And so you're back to your sniper example, that they become totally paranoid about what's going to happen next.
And Halik, didn't they also in France, they were putting something into the oil that was used for the turning of the wheels of locomotives that would then seize up and just make them unable to move.
Yes. Well, they did that a lot. I mean, that's the equivalent to putting sugar in a petrol tank. They didn't have the sugar to spare, but yes, you could put this abrasive stuff in quite easily. And the other thing that people started making for themselves were very effective 4-point nails. You bend 2 nails, weld them together, and they puncture all the tires. And the Germans were absolutely infuriated with that and started threatening to execute everyone living along roads that where these were seen.
I mean, some of these operations were remarkably sort of homespun and simple, actually. And one of the ones which came towards the end of the war was at the time of the D-Day landings, when the Americans and Brits and Canadians were coming ashore in France. There was a desperate attempt on the part of the Germans to move the mighty Das Reich division from where it was posted in central France up to the beachhead in Normandy to sort of confront the newly landed Allied troops. And one way to stop this, dreamed up by a young Scottish chap called Tommy McPherson, was, Pete, some of your listeners and viewers will be familiar with French roads, that they're often lined with trees that go on for miles and miles and miles, at very regular intervals. Well, Tommy McPherson simply thought, well, we'll just start chopping down trees and they'll fall over the roads, and it's going to cause a nightmare for the Germans to start moving these things so that the Das Reich division can, move up towards Normandy. And even better, when they brought down the trees, they then laced them with booby traps and explosives, etc. So as the Germans tried to push them out of the way, there'd be an almighty explosion. So it was a very, very simple and effective way of stopping this massive armored division getting to Normandy. It should have taken about 24, maybe 36 hours for it to reach Normandy. In the event, it took 17 days. By the time it got there, it was too late. The Allies were ashore and they'd established their beachhead.
But I mean, you shouldn't actually exaggerate how much the resistance stopped Das Reich.
Yeah.
Because part of it was ordered specifically wipe out the resistance, which is why you had various massacres, most notably Oradal or Zugdan, where they just completely destroyed the town. And also some of it travelled actually quite happily by whose battery is exhausted?
It's mine. Keep going. Keep going. Don't worry about me.
Some of them elements travel quite happily by train. It was the roads that they really stopped Das Reich on.
Yeah.
And that was very effective. But I think we also have to consider reprisals.
Yes.
Because it was something that sort of limited SOE operations at times, or taught them that they needed to show evidence that it was SOE rather than the locals.
That's a very interesting point, and one that came up quite dramatically, I think, in one of the most spectacular operations planned by SOE, and that, of course, was Operation Anthropoid, which was the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, so Hitler's favorite, his butcher of Prague, the man in charge of Bohemia, Moravia. And when I was researching it in the National Archives, there's quite a fat file of all the operational details and the planning of how to assassinate this incredibly well-guarded man, as I say, very, very close to Adolf Hitler. And reprisals come up repeatedly in this document, that they know that if they succeed, or even if they fail to assassinate Heydrich, there's going to be a massive reprisals on the part of the Nazis. And they took that on board. They said that this is an incredibly important operation to be undertaken, not least because Stalin was putting great pressure on his Western partners to carry out an operation in Czechoslovakia, and so they weighed it up, debated it, and then they decided to go ahead with it anyway, knowing that whatever happened, awful lot of innocent civilians were going to be liquidated, executed because of this operation.
Well, this is also why when the Czech resistance on the ground found out who the target was, they were trying to get the operation stopped by SOE, because they knew that the price would be so terrible. And this is why, with the complete devastation of the village of Lidice, which is where one of the people had a link to there, and the execution of all the men and imprisonment, and many of them died of the women and children, it really effectively stopped the Czech resistance for the rest of the war. The Czech resistance did not do that much until right towards the end. And, it was well publicized, Lidice. So in other countries, they took decisions of, is it worth using assassination as a tool? And in the end, most countries decided not to. In fact, very, very few German leaders get assassinated during the war. I mean, an exception is February 1944, with, I think it's Frank Kuchera in Warsaw, a very unpleasant SS chief there. And that was a deliberate decision. We will take up to 200 innocent people executed. He's worth it. And they assassinated him. Well, you can't tell exactly what the reprisals were then, because at that stage, the Germans were going for street executions and executing all sorts of people that they've been holding hostage for a long time, just at will. So you can't tell what was reprisal and what was generally, we are losing the war and we're going to wipe out anyone who's noticed.
It's worth pointing out, Pete, that these operations, they were incredibly well planned. When they did plan an assassination or something like that, that they took many, many months of planning. And in the case of Heydrich, the question was how to actually kill him. They realized that they were going to, they planned to attack him when he was in his car. He drove generally without bodyguards, without outriders, but he drove very fast. And they worked out that as he drove into Prague every morning, his armor-plated Mercedes had to turn a very, very steep curve in the road. And they worked out through practicing that the car would have to slow down to about 15 miles an hour at this point. And this was the one point, this was the weak point in his journey into Prague each morning. So they decided that this was going to be the place where they attacked him. But how do you blow up an armor-plated Mercedes? That's what they assumed his car would be. You need a very special weapon for that. So they called on the services of this totally eccentric British maverick called Cecil Clarke, who had a brilliant mind and brilliant at thinking outside the box. And they asked him to design effectively a grenade, which was small enough to be hand thrown across a road, but powerful enough to blow through armor plating. And Cecil Clarke developed this extraordinary percussion grenade. And the point about this was that wherever and however it fell on the ground, it would detonate. It would detonate with extreme force. And this is what happened when this was thrown at Heydrich's Mercedes as it slowed down to sort of 15 miles an hour as it rounded this bend. It blew up, and it blew with huge force. It blew up into the car and under the seat on which Heydrich was sitting in, which blew shrapnel and horsehair, which was the seat was stuffed with, blew into his body. And of course, Heydrich would die some days later of septicemia, blood poisoning. Yeah. There's one interesting fact which I was never able to find definitive proof or information about, is that Cecil Clarke was extremely interested in chemical and biological warfare. And he was on very good terms with the team who worked at Porton Laboratories, which are the government laboratories which carried out investigations in this type of warfare. And it is possible that he laced his grenade with some sort of biological agent, but we'll never know that for sure. But it's an intriguing speculation, given that Heydrich died of blood poisoning.
Well, yes, because I think they weren't sure whether the horsehair had been infected with something, but they were aware that there was something appeared to be added, that it wasn't just debris in Heydrich's body. But then again, the Germans are not going to reveal exactly how the deputy to Himmler was killed. I mean, they were appalled by it, but also it was damn embarrassing for them to lose such a figure.
It's quite interesting that when they selected the two assassins, which was Joseph Gabčík and Jan Kubis, they were sent up to, there was a speciality training school on the northwest coast of Scotland called at Arisaig House, where they were trained. And this is where a lot of the saboteurs and would-be guerrillas went to this place to learn the skills they'd need to carry out their tasks. And there was a rather amusing account of both men were absolutely hopeless at throwing a grenade. They just, they trained for days and days and days. And one of the British, he said, I think this might be because they have not been reared in the cricketing tradition. but Arisaig House, I mean, it was run by two extraordinary men called Eric Sykes, known as Bill Sykes, Eric Sykes and William Fairburn, who had been working in Shanghai before the war, what then probably the most dangerous city in the world. And they'd been working in a sort of anti-crime, gangster squad in Shanghai. These guys knew how to fight dirty. And actually, William Fairburn had written a number of books and pamphlets on fighting dirty. And this was their sort of, they put the men through a training program. And it was, thoroughly un-British, old boy, to the things they were telling people how to kill people in the most efficient, most gruesome ways possible. And quite extraordinary, the training that they put the men through. And in fact, Pete, one of your own, William Wild Bill Donovan, came over, of course, to England at one point, met up with Colin Gubbins, who took Wild Bill up to Scotland and showed him Arisaig House. And Wild Bill Donovan was so impressed by what he saw that he poached William Fairburn, took him back to America. And in fact, the first American sabotage training camp was then set up, run by William Fairburn. Of course, at that point, it was before America entered the war, so they couldn't have this on American soil. So they set it up in Canada, and it was known as Camp X. And this is where the first sort of tranche of American would-be saboteurs learned all the dirty tricks of the trade.
I want to, since you're getting into the American side of things and my background as a spy, I'm interested from either of you. Okay, it's one thing to say, yeah, we're going to stop him at a 15-mile-an-hour turn, and then someone's going to figure out how to throw a grenade up. All right, it's one thing to practice that, but drop me into Village X requires a bona fides, that you show up, and it's extraordinarily dangerous just landing on the ground because you were, especially when the word gets out, you are endangering everybody in that village, right? And so how did, in this time where there's not even really radar, how did the resistance and the UK, how did they communicate to expect inbound people? How did they communicate out, like mission accomplished? The communication, the bona fides, how did all of that stuff work? Whichever one of you wants to start, let's talk about that.
You're the experts on this, I think.
Well, each circuit had a radio operator who wasn't necessarily that close to people who'd be forming the reception committee, but they would receive coded messages. Now, for much of the war, the codes were done using a poem. My book goes a lot into the coding that was used, but it was a code that would go back to Britain, where they could decode it and send messages back. Later on, they changed the codes, and so they would have codes printed on silk. There would be one-time pads. They would tear off the bottom when they'd finished with it. But the radio operators were incredibly vulnerable to radio detection on the ground by the Gestapo. And the Gestapo actually devoted a lot of attention to tracing radio. They would do things like triangulation, either with vans, or there would be quite stout people walking around wearing a sort of mobile detection unit, which involved them looking at a watch frequently in order to see whether they were getting closer. Once they had narrowed down the neighborhood, they would switch off electricity, because a lot of the radios needed their electricity. They would switch off their electricity either street by street and then block by block, till they narrowed down where the radio operator was operating. And there was a particularly spectacular disaster in the Netherlands, where the radio operator was caught, and he threw his radio out of the window, hoping it would then get hidden in the deep snow. Unfortunately, it caught on his landlady's washing line. So the Germans found it. And also, unfortunately, foolishly, he had some messages in his pocket. And so gradually they brought in his organizer, and they presented him with an option that he could radio back to England that, yes, he landed successfully, send supplies and things, and then there wouldn't be any reprisals against him. And he tried to let London know, because each radio operator was given a sort of security code. It could be a misplaced letter in certain places. It could be, if a message was 18 letters long, that meant he'd been caught. Well, this chap was still using the old poem code then. And so he did use the message CAUGHT. London missed it. And so ultimately, a lot of sabotage material, some of which is alleged to have been used in the 20th of July plot against Hitler in 1944. And unfortunately, over 50 people were dropped to this compromised network run by the Germans. But other radio operators had more success, because the Germans had this image of the typical resistor, someone like them, a well-kept officer type. And so when they arrived at a house in southwest France, where they knew a radio operator was working, they wasn't on air at the time, but they suspected it was there. Outside, they found this short, swarthy looking man who fitted into the background of the same sort of people, had the same sort of build in that area. And he was struggling to get his suitcase fastened onto his bike. And as he rode off, the suitcase fell off. So Germans helpfully helped him tie it back on. And so the radio operator escaped with his radio to fight another day.
I think it's worth pointing out, because it's an interesting one when you're being dropped into very, very perilous situations, and how do you keep your disguise going? I think it's worth pointing out, on some operations, the British realised that it was just impossible for them to send Brits in. So, for most famously, we touched on the Norsk Hydro. This was the factory producing heavy water, which was what Hitler would need if he was ever going to build an atomic bomb. That this was based in Norway. It was based in a very remote part of Norway. And that the British had attempted, actually several operations had attempted to destroy this factory. It was absolutely critical that it was knocked out of action, and they'd failed miserably. And many Brits had been caught, and they'd been tortured, and they'd been executed. It was a total disaster on several occasions. So they decided on their third attempt that they really had to send in Norwegians, because only Norwegians, A, could pass as Norwegians, but B, understood how to survive for many, many weeks in a desolate landscape, which was well below freezing, covered in deep snow. They needed survival techniques. They needed all sorts of skills that really the British didn't have. So they gathered together this team of Norwegian experts, trained them to the hilt, and then dropped them into this snowbound plateau where they had to survive for weeks on end in the middle of nowhere with no provisions, etc. And then they had to break into the factory. This extraordinarily audacious operation. Norsk Hydro sits on a bluff of rock, this huge ravine around it. They had to climb up the cliffs. They had to break into this incredibly heavily guarded factory, and then they had to blow up the machinery, and then, most importantly, get out again and get back alive. And the reason why this was, Colin Gubbins said this was the consummate, work of sabotage and guerrilla warfare, was that all of the men who took part in that operation ultimately got back to Britain alive. So it was an extraordinary operation, and really one that could not have been done by Brits. It was inconceivable.
The Brits could operate in Western Europe well. In the Balkans, you had the problem that they just did not look like your typical Greek or Yugoslav. And you had the absurd situation in Greece where Monty Woodhouse, over 6 foot with red hair, was given orders that he had to go to Athens to meet someone. And he was surrounded by people who were shorter than him with dark hair. He did manage to make it into Athens, made the meeting and survived, and got out again and survived the war. But it showed how difficult it was for them to move around.
And also, Halik, Halik, I love the thing as well that they'd all been trained at school on classical Greek, and so when they spoke Greek, they sounded like Homer, you know.
Yeah, well, they did. Yes. But I mean, this is why when the Americans came in and OSS started sending agents in, they had the advantage because they had America had a much larger Greek, Yugoslav, Albanian, and particularly Italian population that they could call on. Well, there was a lot of arguments over the Balkans that the Brits insisted it was their area of operations. But in Italy, it really had to be shared. And in fact, OSS did a lot of work there simply because their Italian agents were just, Britain had to use British agents. OSS could use recent Italian immigrants who could just merge into the background.
This is an interesting thing operationally. So when you want to go and put an operational unit into a place, Yugoslavia, Greece, whatever it is, you never have the ground truth that you need to know how to do it well. Just another example on the language thing, Halik, is when Americans learned Arabic, we learned modern standard Arabic. So we're speaking, the Queen's Arabic. And so you show up in super country Iraq. I don't mean country like country. I mean like back home country, like fried chicken, watermelons, all these kind of things. They can understand what you're saying, but you're like, hello, I am, but when the Iraqis speak back, it's not even a dialect. Like there's the words for simple things like watermelon are completely distant from what the actual word is in Arabic. And so our linguists would struggle to understand even the most basic things. And then you get into very specific vocabulary like farm tools. And so someone's saying, take the whatever, and all of this stuff is just, it's all sand in the machine trying to slow down what you're doing, because what you're trying to do is very hard. So it's a great point. And the other thing I wanted to say about bona fides is, in the movies, you have to be obvious because we all don't know. Like, so they'll say like, I've got to get to the tall corn, or some kind of ridiculous statement you would never say. In real life, a bona fides is, hello, yes, I'm looking for the sandwich shop. And they'll say, oh, make sure you try the roast beef. It's down the road and to the left. And so everything, the conversation is contained in this normal day-to-day operational conversation, because you can't expose, you don't know who's listening, who's watching. And so you're always trying to protect things with the most obvious cart full of donkey shit kind of thing that is always mundane, but also the enemy is always looking for it. They're looking for the pattern. So you're trying to avoid those patterns. So I just wanted to inject a little bit of that context, because it doesn't ever stop.
I think that's very true, because the agents who survived the best were those who thought about what they were doing. So every time they arrived at a bar, they had a reason to arrive at the bar. When they met a fellow agent or part of their network in the bar, they were meeting for a reason. He knows where to get hold of a bicycle tire or torch batteries. They both had a reason. So if either of them got questioned or both got questioned, they backed each other up.
I was wondering, Pete, actually, whether you had this in Iraq, because going back to the Greece thing, the problem of language, it wasn't just that when they got into Greece, when they were dropped into Greece, of course, the Greek resistance itself was completely divided, with two sides absolutely hating each other. And to pull off some of these operations, and one of the big ones was Operation Harling, which was blowing up an absolutely key viaduct that crossed this very, very impressive gorge in a very remote part of Greece. This was essential to be blown up because a lot of Rommel's weaponry for North Africa, and this was at a critical point in the war in North Africa, a lot of that weaponry was coming from Germany down through Greece to Piraeus harbour, where it was shipped across the Mediterranean. And they worked out if they took out this one bridge or viaduct, they'd actually could stop for a considerable amount of time weapon supplies going to North Africa. So they decided, to take out this viaduct, the Gorgopotamus viaduct, in the middle of nowhere. They were parachuted in. So there they are. You've got Eddie Myers and Woodhouse. They're speaking their Homeric Greek. They have to bring on board two completely disparate bands of Greek resistance fighters, bring them together, then march off into the mountains and blow up this viaduct, which they successfully did. It was a spectacularly successful operation, but there were many hurdles to be overcome, and language was just one of them.
Well, I mean, and that's true, because the fact that the Greeks were always on the point of civil war, were actually in civil war, meant that later sabotage operations, such as against the Asopus viaduct on the same railway line, actually was left to the Brits to do, because neither side was prepared to help. They preferred to spend more time fighting each other than doing what they were told.
Yeah.
I think also you have to remember that the orders had to make sense. And I mean, I bring this out in my book, that when the Germans are retreating from the Balkans, the orders given to the British missions to pass on to the Greeks and the Yugoslavs is slow down their retreat, because we don't want them at the top of Italy, where they can go in one or two directions. One, to hamper the Soviet advance, which was then in Central Europe, or they could turn down to Italy and hamper the British and Americans. So it was to slow it down. But on the other hand, if your country's been under occupation, and quite a brutal operation for, at that stage, 3.5 getting on to 4 years, why do you want to delay them? You want them out. You buy them the ticket. And so you get the British having to carry out their own sabotage operations, and the resistance paying lip service so that they could continue getting deliveries of weapons.
Yeah, that ability, like, we're trying to eat, and so maybe your strategic goal doesn't align with our day-to-day living goal, and so there's always these negotiations that had to go on. What for each of you, what operations stand out as being particularly notable, whether they were spectacular, a failure, whatever it is? 'Cause sometimes history's cruel, and like the smallest little thing will pivot, and somebody will break their arm, or stand up or something, and then the war changes. I mean, like, there's so many examples of that, that we could think of. So what were some notable things that we haven't discussed?
Well, I think we discussed the operations that I actually devote a chapter to, which is the Gorgopotamus operation in Greece, the assassination of Heydrich, and the Norse Hydro. Well, those are the three that I deliberately target. But I think one that I can say is that the operations in support of the Allied invasion of southern France. The resistance said, you will reach Grenoble in 10 days. I said, don't be ridiculous, the way the Germans back up. No, because we will be working with you. And in fact, there's a rather amusing story where the French secret army agent for the southern France, called Zeller, goes over to Algiers, where the French government, provisional government, is at that time, and he says, "Yeah, I'm going to blow up every bridge." And the chief engineer of the French army, who happened to be his brother, said, "Oh, please don't. I'll only have to rebuild it afterwards." But in fact, they worked very well together to get the American army up to Grenoble in 10 days and ready to fight round Lyon, which took a bit rather longer, as being a much bigger area. And so I think this was one of the most spectacular ways that they could help, by blowing up bridges on the way.
I think one of my favourites, Pete, is we mentioned the Sochaux, the Peugeot, the sabotage of the Peugeot factory. I think that's impressive just because it proved what one man could do, what the RAF couldn't do. But I think one we haven't mentioned, which was also fairly spectacular, was the destruction of the dry dock at Saint-Nazaire on the western coast of France, which of course was the only dry dock on the Atlantic coast of France that could service the Tirpitz, which was Hitler's most fearsome battleship. And so they realized that if they took out this dry dock, if they could destroy it, then it was very, very unlikely that Hitler would dare to deploy the Tirpitz into the Atlantic. He'd be too scared of it getting damaged and not being able to repair it. So they hatched this extraordinary operation where they packed, they got an old battleship called HMS Campbelltown, and they essentially turned it into a floating bomb, a massive floating bomb. And what they did, the men sailed it down the coast of France, they sailed it towards the dry dock, and then they basically rammed it into the dry dock, hoping that it would then, there'd be an almighty explosion and blow this dry dock, into the heavens. Unfortunately, what happened is that the Campbelltown smashed into the dry dock and didn't explode. And over the next sort of 3 or 4 hours, hundreds and hundreds of Germans came on board the Campbelltown to look around at what the British were trying to do. What happened is when about 350 Germans were on board, unexpectedly, the bomb suddenly went off. It was the most spectacular, violent explosion, killed most of the Germans on board, blew the dry dock to the heavens. And in fact, it wasn't repaired for the entire rest of the war. It wasn't repaired till long after the war. It was a monumental act of destruction. And although many, has to be said, many Brits were killed in the operation, many more were taken prisoner in the operation, it was nevertheless a spectacular act of destruction.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I just want to do a little bit of plugging here real quick. So Giles has written a lot of books. We're just talking about one of them. And here is the link for his book. It's in the, if you guys look in the comments, you'll see it. And you know what I always say, and this can always be true. Buddy read, buy it for your friend, read it together, and I promise you will love this book. It's full of so many things. I love the ingenuity of making a six-pound bomb out of condoms and Alka-Seltzer tap. I mean, it's just it's just amazing. I was literally walking through the grocery store listening to it, and I was going right by where the condoms were, and I'm like, this is meant to be. I mean, it's just it's hilarious. And then Durex or whoever the company is has got to be like, what on earth is going on? So this book is fantastic. So I want to plug that, and if you guys want to talk about that in a second, that's great. But let me also plug the award-winning book, The Resistance, and also we had an earlier show on, so I'll put that link in down below too. So let me grab that link here and try to put that in here as soon as I can find it on the fly. Here we go. So right down there's the link for Resistance. Again, amazing. And you can see why I wanted to have these two on together, because one book supports the other. The stories, these people, these lives go back and forth. So yeah, I guess we talked about the $6 bomb. Any comments on that kind of, like you said, ingenuity, all of the ingenuity that comes out of this war. I don't know if you two know this. We figured out here in America to train aircraft carrier landings, which is really a new thing. What they did is they repurposed two old ships, right? That's what happens a lot. And these were side paddle cruise ships in the Great Lakes, and they just put flat tops on top of them. And then, the last step in the combat pilot's training was to go up to Chicago. Chicago is where we taught people how to land on aircraft carriers, and they floated them in Lake Michigan. And then they would just land 2 or 3 times, and off you go to the war. So all the side paddle steamship cruise ships became a viable way to train. So let's talk about some of this ingenuity and being smart enough to buy Durex shares before the war or whatever.
Well, one of the most ingenious weapons, I suppose, is invented by my friend Cecil Clarke, this eccentric maverick who dreamed up this the thing called the limpet mine, which again, it was completely homespun. He went to a local grocery store, he bought a metal bowl, he bought some magnets and a few other bits and pieces, and he effectively designed a magnetic mine. And why was this so brilliant? Because it took one diver and one diver to swim underwater, slap one of these onto the underside of a German battleship, bang, it blows up and it blows a hole in the battleship, and hopefully the battleship will sink. But it was incredibly cheap to make. One of the problems he faced was the actual detonator, how to detonate it, how to get the timing of the detonation right. And he discovered, largely because of his children, liked eating aniseed balls. I don't know if you have them in America, but they're these aniseed flavored sweets and candies, and he realized that in salt water they dissolved with absolute regularity, so they could be absolutely trusted on to, within 3 minutes or whatever it was, they would dissolve, and then they would they'd be used to trigger the explosive device inside his limpet mine. So this was an example of things that he lived in a little market town, Bedford in England, and he could buy all these things in his local high street and built these bombs, which obviously once he built a prototype and it worked, then it went into proper production. But the people watching this and listening to this must be wondering how on earth condoms and Durex come into this. But it should be said that if you're dealing with an aniseed ball that might dissolve, if you're storing these things in a shed and the shed gets damp, of course the aniseed ball might start to disintegrate, and you'll suddenly have all of these things blowing up in your garden shed. What Cecil Clarke realized is if you envelop the whole thing in a condom, a very flexible condom, it was completely watertight, and therefore your limpet mine was safe, your magnetic mine was safe, and it wouldn't detonate in your garden shed. Having said that, he realized that would need an awful lot of condoms. And so what happens is this, I think he was about 55 years old at the time, ended up going up and down his high street of Bedford, going into all the local pharmacies and chemists and buying up their entire stocks of condoms. And he said, I quote, thereby earning myself the reputation of being an extraordinary sexual athlete. Because of course he couldn't tell anyone in these chemists and pharmacies why he was buying quite so many condoms.
But, I can't beat Giles for funny stories, but I think that there's been a trend over warfare for bigger and bigger weapons. One of the most effective weapons handed to the resistance was the Sten gun. And this was a very, very simple weapon, cost a shilling to make, very, very cheap, mass produced. It fired, standard 5mm ammunition, which was widely available on the continent. Yet it wasn't very accurate, except in short range. It was prone for jamming. But in order to supply people who had no weapons training at all with the means to fight back, it was an invaluable weapon. It was dropped in thousands and thousands of them. And the sense of power that someone could get to be given one of these weapons, that at last he can make a contribution and fight back, was tremendous, and it was cheap.
And once these went into production, like you say, Halik, thousands and thousands of these things. I mean, the numbers being produced were quite extraordinary. So one of my men, Millis Jefferies, a brilliant designer of weapons, he designed this thing called the sticky bomb. This was they found it very difficult to blow a hole through German armor plating. And Millis Jefferies had this idea that if you designed a bomb that stuck to a tank before it exploded, you could hugely enhance the explosive power. And I found the memo in which he wrote to Winston Churchill and said he developed the sticky bomb, and it was highly effective at blowing through armor plate. And the memo came back from Winston Churchill, and it simply says in the margin, in Churchill's handwriting, it says make 1 million.
I love that in your book, Jefferies and crew, they're always, like, hey, we made this. And then Churchill gets hammered with the gall, and they come over and they're just like, he's like, bring my friends. Let me show you guys what's going on over here. It was a constant, it was a great showcase on like the capacity of what MD1 was doing.
Yeah, I mean, Churchill absolutely loved to go to MD1. He'd spend his weekends there, go with his daughter. He'd take his friends along, often go with Professor Lindemann, his very close maverick friend. There were some very funny occasions. On one occasion, he went with de Gaulle, who, of course, he did not have the best relationship with. And one of the weapons was fired, a prototype was fired, and it whizzed past de Gaulle's head, just missing him. And Churchill turned to the operator and said, perhaps you could be a bit more accurate next time.
Oh, man. I need to wrap this up, so I promised you guys an hour, and I don't want to go over the time. But I absolutely love this thing. So, Halik, any comments on that? Any final words?
Well, I think that's one thing the war shows, that anyone can do it. I try to bring this out in my talk. You do not have to be a Superman or Superwoman to carry out acts of resistance. It was normal people who did it. They came out of the shadows, did tremendous things, learned to use these weapons, and promptly forgot the knowledge after the war and retreated back into obscurity. But they were very ordinary people. I mean, Harry Ray, who we've talked about a lot, was a schoolmaster. And in fact, he was operating in France despite the fact he spoke French with a strong Mancunian accent. So appalling French and pretty unintelligible English. There were many other people. You get people from being prostitutes to all sorts of walks of life in the resistance.
Hmm.
And to add a final word, I'd say that 1945, Churchill loses the election, a new government comes in. The big question is, what do we do with SOE? We've developed the Special Operations Executive, we've developed this MD1 producing all this weaponry. What do you do with it? Many people were arguing this is going to be essential for the future. We absolutely have to keep this going. We've got invaluable talent. We've learned an enormous amount of skills from this. We should keep it going. But there was a feeling, I think, partly by the new Labour government, that the war was over. We were turning a fresh start and everything. And sadly, both MD1 and SOE were shut down. In America, it was very different. The OSS was viewed as had done invaluable work as well. And of course, what the Americans did was beef it up, put more finance into it, expand it, and change its name. And it became, of course, the CIA. So I think you had a slightly more enlightened approach to this than we did over here.
Then again, the CIA has done some despicable stuff. So,
but then again, so did SOEs.
Well, there you go. Yeah. Well, listen, this has been an absolute treat for me.
Ungentlemanly Warfare.
That's true. This has been great. I love it. You guys, I really appreciate you both coming on. Again, Halik, congratulations on your fantastic award. That is great. I look forward to having you both back on again. Maybe we'll do more of your guys' books here in the future. That would be fun too, because it turns out you don't just write one book. You just keep on doing things. So thank you both for coming on. Any final words? Otherwise, I'm going to roll these credits.
No, I just thank you for having me on again.
Yeah.
It's been great. It's been explosive.
Yeah. Boom!
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly.